That is, with that, we can move on to the final part of the video series that we have finally arrived in, the life cycle of flowering plants or anthophytes or angiosperms, right? So as the name says, flowering plants are unique for having a structure called a flower that is involved in reproduction, right? So here in the resource you have a description about a flower, right? So we'll go through the diagram and also the description, and I'll help you understand it, right? So the usual story is there before. Sporophyte is the dominant plant, obviously, because the flowering plants are the most evolutionary advanced class of plants that we have to study. Gametophytes are short-lived, very microscopic, right? Microscopic and entirely dependent. Okay. Now, the flower. Sporophytes, that is the dominant structure or the dominant generation, will produce reproductive structures called flowers. Right? This is the definition of a flower. If they ask you, it's a specialized shoot with 4 whorls of modified leaves named sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Right? So, a whorl of modified leaves. We'll talk about what are these modifications and also what are they derived from, right? First of all, let's talk about your sterile plants, that means the plants that are not involved in reproduction. Those are your sepals and your petals, right? So sepals are usually the outer parts, right? Usually they are supposed to be green usually, right? Sepals, right? Sepals cover the plant when it's still a bud. Have you seen sepals, right? They're usually green and enclose the flower before it opens, right? A protective role there. Okay. Petals are usually brightly colored in most flowers, and if that flower is germinated or pollinated by animals, right, it will have bright colors, right? That is to be a visual attraction to attract pollinators, right? But if the plant is wing pollinated, it will generally lack brightly colored parts, right? Because there is no purpose in getting attention, right, to the flower. So these are the petals, the big colored parts that are dominating the flower structure if it's an animal pollinated plant, right? So these are sterile floral organs, you have petals and sepals, right? Then we can move on to the parts that play the reproductive role, right? So we said it's a flower is a whorl of modified leaves, right? So if you remember, we learned about specialized leaves that bear sporangia. They are known as sporophylls, right? So if a sporophyll is bearing microsporangia, that will become microspores. It's a microsporophyll, right? So usually microspores will become the male gametophyte, right? So the modified part or the modification of microsporophylls in your flowering plants, now we call these modified microsporophylls as stamens, right? So stamens is generally considered as the male part of the plant, right? So it has 3 parts, your stamen, filament, and 2 terminal lobes called anther, right? So those are the parts. So you can see this. So these are filaments, right? Filaments of your stamen, right? These two terminal lobes are called anther. So anther and filament are the parts of your stamen, right? Now, let's move on to, so there's another description of the anther, or part that is part of your stamen, right? Let's talk about the female part first. That is the megasporophylls now, right? So what derived structure can we see in a flower from megasporophylls? That part is known as the carpel, right? Carpels, right? Carpel has 3 parts: stigma, the style, and the ovum. Okay, so these are the 3 parts, right? This is the stigma, that is the terminal part, and the style connects this expanded part at the bottom, that is the ovary. So the style connects the stigma to the ovary. So those are the 3 parts of your carpel, Alright. So the stigma is usually sticky. We'll come across this when we are doing fertilization. So pollination. Stigma is usually sticky to receive pollen, right? So the pollen that are getting dispersed by wind will get stuck on a stigma, so that will aid your pollination, right? So the solan base of the carpel has the ovary, right? So ovary is one of the most unique features of the flowering plant that will later become, if the flower it gets fertilized, right? If the seeds inside the flower gets fertilized, this ovary will become a fruit, okay, a fruit, right? So ovary is like the containment structure, like the bag that contains your ovules, right? Ovules. So the style, as I mentioned, it connects, it's sort of a neck that connects the ovary with the stigma. Okay, now let's go through this diagram, which will help you to have a visual idea about how the flowering plant life cycle takes place. So it's all focused around this guy, that is your flower, right? So the flower, as I mentioned earlier, it's a modified shoot, right? So if we ignore these sterile parts, what are these sterile parts? These colored parts, they are the petals, and these green colored, those are sepals, right? So if we ignore them, the parts that we have to focus on are your stamens, that are actually the microsporophylls modified, that will give rise to a male gametophyte, so we can consider it the male part of a plant, a flower, and then the carpel, which are modified megasporophylls. So let's follow your female parts first, the carpel. So what we are focusing specifically is on your ovary, right? So the ovary encloses your ovules, which are ovules are unique to your seed plants, right? So the ovary encloses the ovules, and the ovules themselves enclose what? The megasporangium, right? Megasporangium, if you remember, they are the reproductive organs of the sporophyte that will give rise to a megaspore, right? So the next stage is within the megasporangium, there's going to be one of the cells will differentiate into a megaspore mother cell, and that cell will undergo meiosis to produce a haploid megaspore, right? So meiosis actually produces 4 megaspores and only one of them survives, right? That megaspore will become the female gametophyte. You can see here, right? So this is the megasporangium, and it will produce 4 megaspores. And I'll remind you like quickly. So surrounding the ovary, we have a protective structure called the integument, right? And the integument has a small opening or a pore called the micropyle, right? Through which the pollen grain enters, right? So now this is your mature ovule, okay? So I mentioned earlier, under gymnosperms, we consider 2 stages of the ovule. So this is your immature ovule, and this is the mature ovule. Mature ovule contains what? Not the megasporangium, but a mature female gametophyte, right? In your flowering plants, the female gametophyte is given a special name called the embryo sac, right? So embryo sac is composed of a number of cells, right? It actually consists of 8 nuclei in 7 cells, right? Okay. We'll consider that the entire structure of the embryo sac after going through the resource, right? Let's just follow, right? So let's stop the female cycle and let's come to the male, that is, right? So follow the stamen or the microsporophylls. So stamen has 2 parts, what? The filament and the anther, right? So on top of a filament, we have 2 terminal lobes called anther, right? So this is a magnified image of such an anther, right? Inside anther, so anther is another name for your microsporangia, right? Inside anther, then again, the microsporangia of flowering plants has a unique name called pollen sac, right? So what are microsporangia? Those are the reproductive organs of the sporangium, sporophyte that will produce microspores, right? So the microspore mother cell, or here it is called as the microsporocyte, that will undergo meiosis, right? So all 4 microspores produced in such a way will remain functional, and they will become enclosed by the pollen grain wall, right? And the microspore will become the male gametophyte. So a pollen grain contains what? It has a wall and a male gametophyte, right? Now, unique feature again in your flowering plants, the male gametophyte has 2 cells, see here, called a generative cell and a tube cell. Okay, so out of these, the generative cell is the more important one. We'll see how, right? So this is like a real image of, it's 75 micrometers, right? It's an image of a male gametophyte. Okay, then so these pollen grains are the ones that are getting like dispersed by wind. And see, I mentioned earlier, the stigma can be sticky, right? If since to receive the pollen and also to get hold of pollen, and on the stigma, this pollen grain can germinate, grow. It actually specifically grows your pollen tube, right? So the pollen tube is actually generated by the tube cell. Okay, so through the pollen tube, there's going to be the delivery of sperm into the egg, right? Produced by the female gametophyte, right? So actually, let's talk about the 2 sperms now, right? Can you see like 2 dots here? There's actually 2 sperm cells getting transported by your pollen tube, right? These 2 sperms are produced by actually this generative cell, okay? Generative cell. So the pollen tube is going to go through your style and reach the ovary and reach an ovule itself. So a mature ovule contains what? A female gametophyte, right? A female gametophyte is going to have an egg cell, one of the 8 nuclei, right? So you can see, let's label these cells, right? There's going to be 8 nuclei in 7 cells. You can see 3x, 3 times we have 3 antipodal cells. We have 2 polar nuclei, can you see? And 2 synergid cells and 1 egg. So 3 plus 4 plus 1, that is 8, right? So 8 nuclei, 7 cells. So the sperms that are, so this is the pollen tube, right? Reaching in through the integument into the female gametophyte in the ovule, and the sperm nuclei, one of the sperm nuclei is going to combine with the egg nucleus, and the other one is going to combine here, very very important, is going to combine with the 2 polar nuclei in the, we call this part the central cell, okay? It's going to combine with the 2 polar nuclei in the central cell, and it's going to produce a triploid structure called the endosperm. So you are familiar with the term endosperm. It was found in a gymnosperm seed as well. But if you go back, in the gymnosperm, the endosperm was what? It was haploid. It was only N, because it was the remaining female gametophyte. But now, this endosperm in flowering plant is a triploid endosperm. 3N, very very important to remember, right? 3N. So then the normal story, your fertilized egg will become a zygote, right? That zygote will become an embryo enclosed within now the mature seed, right? The ovule has now become a seed. So the seed contains an embryo, diploid, endosperm, that is actually the stored food for the embryo, and the seed coat that was derived from the integument, right? So this is the seed of a flowering plant. That seed will germinate if dispersed to a suitable habitat and will become a sporophyte. A sporophyte will produce a reproductive structure for the flower again. So this is the idea, right? Okay. Let's quickly go through what is there in the resource, right? So we stopped here. Let's talking about anther. So anther is modified microsporophylls, right? So it has microsporangia. Microsporangia has a special name called pollen sac, right? So inside microsporangia, you have microspore mother cells. They will produce microspores by meiosis, right? So microspores will develop into male gametophytes, right? Male gametophyte, I mentioned it has two cells, the tube cell and the generative cell. See, this is the male gametophyte, right? Generative cell, and the tube cell. Okay, tube cell. Then carpels are the megasporophylls, right? It has stigma, we talked about that. So the ovule, same story, it has a megaspore mother cell inside, right? And it will produce 4 megaspores by meiosis and only one will remain functional. The functional megaspore develops into the female gametophyte. Now the female gametophyte has a special name, embryo sac. It's a very, very reduced structure in your flowering plants. The gametophyte is very reduced. We started with pogonatum, right? Pogonatum had a dominant gametophyte. Now this is a very microscopic structure, the gametophyte. So then I talked about this embryos, contents of the embryo sac. 8 nuclei in 7 cells, right? 3 antipodal, 2 pola in the central cell, 2 synergids and 1 egg. Egg is the important guy, right? So pollination will take place. The pollen grains with the male gametophyte will deposit on the stigma, right? And now we have the 2 definitions of self-pollination and cross-pollination here, right? So self-pollination means within the same plant, you are getting pollen from one flower to the another flower in the same plant. So the same plant means the same organism, right? So that is self-fertilization. So it can be the same flower anther to same flower stigma, or from a different flower in the same plant to the stigma of another flower in the same plant. But still it is self-fertilization because it's within the same plant, right? If the pollen is getting transferred to the stigma of a flower, another plant, so it's different plant of the same species, it has to be the same species, right? But if it's getting transferred from one plant to the other, it is going to be called as cross-pollination, right? So usually cross-pollination is preferred because of the shuffling of genes. I'm not going to talk about that in detail here, right? But cross-pollination is beneficial for evolutionary purpose and also to get a stronger new generation. So it has special adaptations such as heterostyly, self-infertility and unisexuality. Heterostyly means the styles are of different lengths. Okay. Self-infertility means if you get the pollen of a flower of the same plant to another flower of the same plant, it's not going to get fertilized, right? Self-infertility. It's going to reject its own pollen. Unisexuality is if a plant produces only flowers of male flowers or female flowers, it cannot get self-fertilization, right? Or self-pollination. So unisexuality is another adaptation. Right, let's move on to your fertilization stage, right? So as I mentioned, the pollen grain will germinate once it is placed on the stigma. It extends a pollen tube that will go through the style, right? So if you remember, the generative cell gives rise to the 2 sperms, right? So these are the 2 sperms. Can you see? Right? So from the generative cell, we get 2 sperms. Okay? When the pollen tube reaches the ovary, it will move through the micropyle. It's a pore in the integument, and discharges the 2 sperm into the embryo sac. Now we are going to come into another unique feature of your flowering plants, that is called double fertilization. It is unique to angiosperms. Double fertilization is, remember we have two sperms, right? So one of the sperms is going to fuse with the proper egg cell or the egg nucleus, right, forming the zygote, and the other sperm is going to combine with the two polar nuclei in the central cell, right? So this double fertilization indicates a signal for the ovule. Now you have to become a seed, right? That is the signal. So the ovule will now become a seed, zygote become an embryo, triploid nucleus from the polar nucleus and the sperm nucleus will become the endosperm that will store food, right? So it will synchronize with the endosperm development and development of embryo. So double fertilization is sort of a signal, right? Now it's time for you to become a seed. So this is the definition of a seed. It contains the embryo, endosperm, and a seed coat. It came across this in gymnosperms as well. But the unique feature of your flowering plants is your ovules and then the seeds are enclosed by an ovary. This ovary after fertilization becomes what? A fruit, right? A fruit, right? So here it says a fruit is an enlarged and developed ovary, usually after being stimulated by fertilization. So your double fertilization acts as an indicator or a signal for this ovary into fruit development as well. Okay. If a flower has not been pollinated, the fruit does not develop and the entire flower falls away. Right? Now what happens to the ovary? The ovary wall will get converted to the coat of the fruit or the covering of the fruit, which is called as the pericarp. Okay, key term that you have to remember, pericarp. Right? Then there are some definitions for parthenocarpy, right? Parthenocarpy, I'm not going to cover those in this video. It was strictly about the plant life cycle, so that brings an end to this video series. So if you're watching this through YouTube, I'll be putting a link to join my WhatsApp group, right? So you can download this visual supplement that acts as a tutorial and you can follow it while watching the video. Thank you.